On the morning of the 17th of September, 2004, a property manager named Cecile Odom drove to a beach rental cottage on the southern end of Pelican Shoal, North Carolina, to prepare it for the next week's tenants and found the front door unlocked, the ceiling fan turning slowly above an unmade bed, 2 coffee mugs on the kitchen counter with coffee still in them, and no sign of the couple who had checked in 4 days earlier and whose rental agreement ran through Saturday. The couple's car was in the gravel lot beside the cottage. Their luggage was inside. Their return ferry tickets were on the kitchen table beside a folded map of the island with 3 beaches circled in blue ink. The woman's medication, a weekly prescription that the responding deputy would later note she would not have left voluntarily, was on the bathroom shelf beside her toothbrush. The man's wallet was on the bedside table. $63 in it. His driver's license. A photograph of the 2 of them at what appeared to be a wedding, not their own, both of them laughing at something outside the camera's frame, the particular laughter of people who are entirely at ease in the company they are keeping. Pelican Shoal was a barrier island accessible only by a ferry that ran twice daily, at 7 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. The ferry manifest for every crossing between the couple's check-in and Cecile Odom's arrival showed no record of either of their names. The island's permanent population was 212 people. The seasonal rental population during the second week of September had been 31 additional visitors across 7 properties. Nobody reported seeing the couple after Tuesday evening. Nobody reported seeing anything unusual. The island offered, in the directions away from its small commercial center, 2 miles of beach to the north and 3 miles to the south, a maritime shrub forest that occupied the interior of the island in a dense and largely impenetrable thicket, and the Atlantic Ocean on its eastern face and Pamlico Sound on its western, both bodies of water sufficiently large and sufficiently indifferent to the concerns of a 2-person missing persons investigation to offer no useful boundary. The couple were Noel Casper, 34, and his wife Adrienne Casper, 31. They had been married for 3 years. They had driven from their home in Raleigh to the ferry terminal at Cedar Point on a Saturday morning in September to begin a week they had been planning since January. A delayed honeymoon of sorts, Adrienne had told a colleague the week before they left, because the year they had married had not permitted the time and the money for the trip they had wanted, and they had finally, 3 years later, made the time and saved the money. They were never found. 20 years later, in the summer of 2024, the cottage at the southern end of Pelican Shoal was sold as part of an estate settlement. The new owners, who planned to renovate and operate it as a premium rental, hired a contractor to assess the property's structural condition. The contractor's inspection required access to the crawl space beneath the cottage's raised foundation. What the contractor found beneath the cottage was not structural damage. This is the story of Noel and Adrienne Casper, a couple who drove to a ferry terminal on a Saturday morning with a week's worth of hope and a map with 3 beaches circled in blue ink, and who did not come home. And what the ground beneath a beach cottage on a barrier island had been holding for 20 years, while the ferry ran its twice daily crossing and the Atlantic came and went with the permanent indifference of very large things. Subscribe before we go any further, because this island kept its secret for 20 years, and what it gave up changes the shape of everything. Pelican Shoal, North Carolina. 3.5 miles long and at its widest point just under a mile across, oriented northeast to southwest in the pattern of the barrier islands that lined the North Carolina coast, the chain of narrow land formations that had been deposited by the interaction of Atlantic drift and continental shelf geology across thousands of years, and that served the dual function of protecting the mainland sounds from the full force of open ocean weather and providing, in the warmer months, a destination for the people who came from the inland cities and the Piedmont towns to spend a week or a weekend with the ocean on one side and the sound on the other, and the particular quality of island life that was the quality of a life temporarily simplified by the fact of water on all boundaries. The island had a ferry terminal at its northern end, a commercial strip of modest ambition consisting of a general store, a bait and tackle shop, 2 restaurants of which one operated year-round and one only from May through October, and a small realty office that managed the island's rental properties with the efficient intimacy of a business that knew every property and most of its tenants personally. The southern end of the island was less developed, the properties there larger in their lot sizes and more separated from one another by the encroachment of the maritime shrub forest, the dense growth of wax myrtle and yopon holly and live oak that filled the interior of the island with a vegetative darkness that the sunlight reached only in pieces at certain hours of certain days. The cottage at the southern end that Noel and Adrienne Casper had rented in September of 2004 sat 200 yards from the beach on a lot bordered on its landward side by a section of the shrub forest and on its northern side by a lane that connected it to the nearest neighboring property, itself a seasonal rental whose tenants had departed 3 days before the Caspers arrived. The cottage was a board and batten structure on a raised foundation, the raising necessary for the flood insurance that coastal properties required, which placed the living space approximately 3 feet above the ground and left beneath it a crawl space of corresponding dimensions running the full footprint of the cottage. The crawl space had a vent screen on each of its 4 sides, standard construction for moisture management in coastal environments, and a timber-framed access panel on the northern face, the side facing the lane, secured by a simple turn latch that required no key and that a person with knowledge of its presence could open and close in a matter of seconds. Cecile Odom had cleaned that cottage 12 times a year for 9 years before the Caspers checked in. She had never opened the access panel. There had been no reason to open it. It was a crawl space beneath a beach rental cottage on a barrier island, and the things it contained were the things such spaces normally contained. The underside of the living space above, the pipework and the electrical routing and the compacted sand of a coastal barrier island doing what coastal barrier island sand did across the seasons, shifting and settling and absorbing whatever came from above. Whatever came from above. The estate attorney who had managed the property's sale in 2024 had disclosed the 20-year-old missing persons case in the sale documents as a matter of legal obligation and practical honesty, noting that the case had never been solved and that the property had been investigated in 2004 without result and had continued operating as a rental property in the intervening years. The new owners had received the disclosure, considered it, and proceeded with the purchase on the grounds that an unsolved disappearance 20 years old was a historical fact rather than a present encumbrance. They had not expected the contractor's inspection to make it a present one again. Delia Marsh had been investigating cold cases for 8 years, initially as part of a podcast team whose audience had grown sufficiently large to generate the resources for genuine investigative journalism, and then, after the podcast had run its course, as an independent journalist whose long-form work appeared in print and digital publications and whose 2 books had established her reputation as someone who brought to cold cases the specific combination of documentary patience and narrative intelligence that the form required and that audiences for it had learned to distinguish from the more sensationalized treatment the subject sometimes received. She was 37 years old. She had grown up in the North Carolina Piedmont, in a family that had occasionally driven to the coast for summer weeks, and she had a specific and personal relationship to the geography of the barrier islands that she did not invoke in her professional framing of cases, but that was present in her engagement with the landscape when she returned to it, a familiarity that was not nostalgic, but was physical. The body's memory of a particular quality of air and light and the sound of water on both sides of a narrow strip of land. She had known about the Casper case since it was first reported in the fall of 2004. She had been in college at the time, studying journalism, and the case had appeared in the regional news in the way that disappearances from barrier islands appeared, with the initial coverage generated by the geographic particularity of the setting and the specific puzzle of the ferry manifest, the island as closed room quality that made the case immediately legible as a mystery in the formal sense. A bounded space with a known population and a couple who should have been findable and were not. She had followed its subsequent non-development with the ambient attention she maintained for unresolved cases in the region. She had noted the 2 state-level reviews that had been conducted in 2007 and 2012, and that had produced no new leads. She had noted the periodic anniversary coverage that regional papers ran when the cycle of significant numbers prompted it. She had noted the development of a small online community of people who discussed the case and generated theories with the investment characteristic of communities organized around unsolved mysteries, theories ranging from the plausible to the elaborate, and none of them, as far as she could determine, grounded in evidence beyond what the original reporting had made public. She had been in Raleigh working on an unrelated piece when the news item about the contractor's inspection appeared on a Thursday in June of 2024. Published by the Carteret County News-Times in a brief item that was long on the geographic setting and short on specifics, noting that a discovery had been made during a structural inspection of a Pelican Shoal property and that the Carteret County Sheriff's Department was investigating in connection with a cold case from 2004. The item did not name the property or the case. Delia had read it once and had called the ferry terminal at Cedar Point within 10 minutes to reserve a seat on the following morning's 7 o'clock crossing. The ferry crossing from Cedar Point to Pelican Shoal took 45 minutes and passed through the lower reach of Pamlico Sound in the particular quality of early morning coastal light that was specific to that geography and that she had not experienced in several years, and that her body registered on the open deck of the ferry with the sound water moving around her and the island's profile visible ahead on the horizon as something between memory and present sensation. The two collapsed together by the familiarity of the place. The island's northern terminal was quiet at 7:45 in the morning. The commercial strip was beginning its day, the general store open with its light on and the smell of coffee reaching the dock. She walked the length of the commercial strip and turned south on the island's single-paved road, pulling her roller bag behind her, passing the properties that occupied the northern section of the island, with their beach access and their rental signs and their particular summer-worn quality of buildings that spent most of the year serving a function rather than being inhabited in the residential sense. She had booked a room at one of the two restaurants that offered seasonal accommodation, a decision that gave her a base on the island without the complications of renting a cottage in the vicinity of the case's property. The proprietor, a lean and sun-dark woman named Bet Cowan, who had run the establishment for 20 years and who had known the island since childhood, greeted her with the calibrated welcome of a host who had learned to read the difference between a tourist and a person who had come to Pelican Shoal for a specific purpose and who offered each the appropriate version of hospitality. Delia introduced herself and her work without concealment, which was her consistent practice in small communities where concealment was both impractical and counterproductive. Bet Cowan listened, her expression shifting from the pleasantly professional to the personally engaged in the way it shifted when the subject being raised was one she had a stake in. She said she remembered the Caspers. She said everyone on the island who had been here in September of 2004 remembered the Caspers. She poured coffee without asking and sat across the narrow counter and told Delia that the case had never left the island the way cases were supposed to leave when they went cold. She said it had stayed here in the specific way that things stayed in small places where the people who had been present for them were still present, where the geography had not changed and the buildings had not changed, and the ferry still ran at 7 and 4, and the sound was still on the western side and the ocean was still on the eastern side. And the absence of any answer was still in the same place it had always been, waiting. She said she had thought, across 20 years, about the 2 coffee mugs on the kitchen counter with coffee still in them. She said she had thought about them specifically and repeatedly in the way that small concrete details sometimes anchored the memory of large and unresolvable things. The mugs with their partial coffee becoming the object through which the unresolvable weight of the case was carried in her mind, more vivid and more present than the abstractions of investigation and theory. Delia asked her what she believed had happened to the Caspers. Bet looked at the counter between them. Then she looked at the window and the morning light coming through it from the direction of the sound. She said she believed they had not left the island. She said she had believed this since 2004 and had said so to the investigators and had continued to believe it across 20 years of the island's ordinary life proceeding around the unresolved fact of it. She said the island was 3.5 miles long. She said 212 people lived on it year-round. She said there were things on that island that the investigation had not found, because the investigation had not known where to look, and that whoever had taken the Caspers from the cottage at the southern end had known the island in a way that the investigators had not, with the specific intimate knowledge of someone for whom the island's geography was not a map, but a body of accumulated personal understanding. She said she had thought about that for 20 years. Delia opened her notebook. The Carteret County Sheriff's Department assigned the reopened case to Detective Sergeant Orrin Pell on the second day after the contractor's discovery. Pell was 53 years old, a Carteret County native who had worked coastal communities for 26 years and who had the particular understanding of barrier island communities that only long residents produced, the understanding that was not merely geographic but social and institutional, a knowledge of how things worked in places where the smallness of the population made certain dynamics that operated invisibly in larger communities visible by default. He had been a deputy in 2004 and had been on the original Casper investigation team. He had spent 11 days on the island in the initial investigation period and had conducted 47 interviews and had driven the island's road from the northern terminal to the southern end and back more times than he had counted, and he had found nothing. And the nothing had stayed with him across 20 years in the specific way of an early career failure of a case that had defined the kind of investigator he had decided to become in its aftermath, organized and methodical and unwilling to accept the first available explanation when the evidence was not providing any explanation at all. He had requested the reassignment when the contractor's discovery was reported to the department. His supervisor had approved the request without argument because Pell's history with the case was more asset than liability, and because there was no investigator in the department with more institutional knowledge of the Pelican Shoal geography and its community than Pell carried from the original investigation and the subsequent years. He drove to Cedar Point on the Monday morning after the discovery and took the 7 o'clock ferry. He stood on the deck for the 45-minute crossing with his case file under his arm and looked at the island's profile on the southern horizon as it came into focus through the morning haze over the sound, the low and narrow landform taking shape against the sky in the particular way that barrier islands came into focus on approach, gradually and then with sudden completeness, as if they had been there all along at exactly the resolution in which they now appeared and had merely been waiting for the viewer to close the distance sufficient to see them clearly. He went directly to the cottage on the southern end. The new owners, a couple named Felix and Truda Harbeck, who had purchased the property from the Odom estate, the property having passed through Cecile Odom's family after her death in 2019, had vacated the cottage at the sheriff department's request and were staying at Bet Cowan's establishment with the cooperative patience of people who had bought a beach rental and received a crime scene, and who were managing the distance between those two things with the reasonable grace of people who understood that their cooperation was not optional and had decided to make a virtue of the understanding. The forensic team from the State Bureau had deployed to the island on the previous Friday, traveling in the same ferry system as everyone else, their equipment in cases stacked on the ferry's cargo deck with the practical accommodation of a transport system that had been moving materials on and off the island for 40 years. And that made no particular distinction between the recreational equipment of vacationing families and the forensic equipment of a state investigation. The team had been working the cottage and its crawl space since Friday afternoon. Pell was met at the cottage by the team's lead, a forensic scientist named Dr. Hannah Terrell, who was compact and precise in the way of people for whom precision was not a professional style, but a personal characteristic, present in every movement and every communication and every decision about what the evidence said and what it did not yet say. She briefed him on the current state of the forensic work with the flat efficiency of someone who had been asked the same questions multiple times since Friday, and had organized the answers into a form she could deliver without losing the analytical attention she needed for the work itself. She said the crawl space access panel on the northern face of the cottage had shown evidence of modification consistent with regular use across a period substantially longer than the Casper rental period, which had been 4 days. The turn latch mechanism had been replaced at some point with a different latch of the same external appearance, but with an internal mechanism that permitted silent opening and closing, and that a person with knowledge of the modification could operate quickly and without tools. The modification was not visible from the exterior and would not have been identified in a routine property inspection. She said the crawl space itself was dry and ventilated in the standard coastal construction manner, but was not empty in the way that a crawl space used only for its intended structural function would be empty. The sand floor showed compaction patterns in specific areas consistent with regular foot traffic. Not the random compaction of an accessed space, but the directed compaction of a space navigated along consistent routes, the marks of someone who knew the layout and moved through it with familiarity. Along the eastern interior face of the crawl space, the face beneath the cottage's bedroom wall, the forensic team had found a section of the pier block foundation column that was not a foundation column. It was a constructed element of the same concrete block material as the genuine foundation columns, indistinguishable from the exterior from the genuine columns, built to match them in dimension and surface texture, and positioned where a genuine column would be positioned in the structural grid. But it was hollow, and its interior was accessible through a block in its southern face that had been fitted, like the access panel on the cottage's exterior, with a mechanism that permitted silent opening and closing. The interior of the false column measured approximately 18 inches by 18 inches and extended from the ground to a height of 4 feet, sufficient for storage but not for occupancy. What it had contained, and what the forensic team was in the process of documenting when Pell arrived, were items that had no business being in a structural element of a beach rental cottage's foundation. Pell looked at the preliminary photographs on Terrell's tablet without speaking for a long time. The photographs showed a woman's watch, a man's wedding ring, a small camera of the disposable type that had been common in 2004, a folded piece of paper in a plastic sleeve, and a zip-tied bundle of what appeared to be documents or cards. The forensic team had not yet opened the plastic sleeve or the zip-tied bundle. They had documented the items in situ and had begun the process of analysis that would determine their connection to the Caspers and potentially their connection to other things not yet established. Pell looked at the wedding ring for a long time. He looked at it with the specific attention of someone who had interviewed the families of missing persons and who knew that a wedding ring in a false column in a beach cottage crawl space occupied a category of evidence whose implications did not require forensic analysis to begin making themselves clear. He thanked Terrell and walked out of the crawl space access and stood beside the cottage in the morning air of the Pelican Shoal southern end, the shrub forest behind him and the lane to his north and the cottage's pale board and batten exterior to his right, and he looked at the access panel in the foundation face for a moment before he looked away. He thought about the ferry manifest. In 2004, one of the questions the investigation had organized itself around was the ferry manifest and its failure to show either of the Caspers departing the island. The manifest had been treated as the primary evidence for the conclusion that the Caspers had not left the island voluntarily, which was the correct conclusion, but it had also generated a secondary inference that the investigation had not fully examined. The inference that the person responsible for the Caspers' disappearance had also not left the island by the ferry in a way that would have been visible in the manifest, which implied either that the responsible person was a permanent resident of the island or that there was a means of departing the island that the manifest did not capture. The Sound on the western side. 3.5 miles of water separating the island from the mainland. The ferry, a 45-minute crossing, twice daily. And the mainland shore, visible from the island's western beach on clear days, close enough that a person with a small watercraft and the knowledge of the Sound's tidal patterns and the patience of someone who had been operating on this island with specific knowledge of its geography for long enough to have developed that patience could cross it in a direction and at a time that generated no record. Pell pulled out his notebook and wrote 2 words at the top of a clean page. The words were, watercraft access. He looked at the 2 words, and at the Sound visible beyond the western tree line of the island's southern end, and he thought about a false column in a crawl space, and a turn latch modification, and a man who had spent 20 years on this island or adjacent to it, because nobody built that kind of infrastructure in a property they were unfamiliar with. Nobody modified a latch and constructed a false foundation column in a beach rental's crawl space without a knowledge of the property so intimate that it had passed through the stage of familiarity into the stage of ownership in the private and proprietary sense that had nothing to do with the deed. He thought about the ferry manifest and all the crossings it had recorded and all the names it had not needed to record because the crossing had not been made by ferry. He walked to the western side of the cottage and looked at the sound and began making calls. The forensic analysis of the items recovered from the false column in the crawl space of the Pelican Shoal cottage began at the State Bureau's laboratory in Raleigh on the Wednesday following the discovery, the items having been transported off the island in the Monday afternoon ferry in the sealed evidence containers that Dr. Hannah Terrell's team used for materials whose chain of custody required documentation at every point of handling. The transport had been unremarkable. The evidence containers, stacked in the ferry's cargo hold alongside a cooler belonging to a vacationing family, and several boxes of supplies for the island's general store. The ordinary mixed cargo of a twice-daily crossing carrying what the island needed and what the island was giving up simultaneously without distinguishing between them. The folded piece of paper in the plastic sleeve was opened first under the laboratory's documentation lighting with the full photographic record that the process required. It was a single sheet, folded twice, written on one side in a hand that was compact and controlled, and that the handwriting analysis unit would subsequently characterize as consistent with a left-handed writer of approximately middle age. The specific lateral pressure patterns and the characteristic ligature formations that left-hand writing produced when the writer had sufficient practice to have developed a consistent personal style. The content of the note was not addressed to anyone and was not signed. It read as follows, and Terrell read it to Pell over the phone on Wednesday afternoon while he was on the island conducting interviews, her voice flat and precise in the way she delivered all information regardless of its weight. They came to the wrong cottage at the wrong time, and I am sorry for what that meant, but not for what came before it, and not for what will come after. The island keeps what it is given. I have been giving it things for a long time, and it has kept them well. If you are reading this, it means something has changed that I did not plan for, and I would ask only that you understand the island before you judge what the island has held. Pell listened to the note being read and was quiet for a moment after Terrell finished. Then he asked her to read the last sentence again. She read it. He wrote it in his notebook verbatim and looked at it for a long time after the call ended. The island keeps what it is given. I have been giving it things for a long time, and it has kept them well. He walked from the point on the island's road where he had taken the call to the western shore, a 10-minute walk through the maritime shrub forest on the narrow path that cut through it from the road to the sound-facing beach. The sound beach was narrow and dark-sanded compared to the ocean beach on the eastern side. The sound water a different color than the ocean, darker and more opaque, moving in the smaller rhythmic patterns of a contained body of water rather than the deep Atlantic swells that reached the eastern shore. He stood at the waterline and looked across the sound toward the mainland, visible as a low dark line on the western horizon 5 miles distant, and thought about what the note meant and about the plural in the sentence he had asked Terrell to repeat. Things, not thing, not the Caspers, who were 2 people and 1 event. Things, plural, suggesting a multiplicity that the sentence's other clause confirmed. For a long time, he walked back through the shrub forest and called Delia Marsh, whose presence on the island he had noted on the Monday morning and whose work he had looked up during the ferry crossing before she had introduced herself to him at the cottage site, with the directness of a journalist who had decided that introducing herself before being noticed was better than being noticed first. He had accepted this approach with the measured cooperation he offered journalists whose work he respected, which was not all of them, but was some, and Delia Marsh was in the category of some. He read her the note. She was quiet for the full length of time the note required. Then she said the word things and stopped. Then she said, "How long is a long time on an island with 212 permanent residents?" He said that was the question he had been standing on the sound beach thinking about for the last 15 minutes. She said she would meet him at Bet Cowan's in an hour. The zip-tied bundle from the false column had been opened by Terrell's team on Tuesday and had produced the finding that Pell had been simultaneously expecting and not expecting, in the way that significant findings sometimes arrived, their possibility having been established by the surrounding evidence and their actuality still carrying the weight of confirmation beyond the weight of anticipation. The bundle contained 7 items. A driver's license belonging to Noel Casper, expired in 2007 and therefore not renewed because Noel Casper had not been alive in 2007 to renew it. A library card belonging to Adrienne Casper. A folded receipt from a restaurant in Raleigh dated the Saturday of the Caspers' departure for the ferry terminal, the last day of their documented presence in the ordinary world. A receipt for 2 breakfasts and 2 coffees in the amount of $14.60, the small and unremarkable financial record of a morning that had not known it was the last ordinary morning. And 4 additional items that did not belong to the Caspers and whose presence in the bundle required an expansion of the investigation's scope that Pell had submitted to the department on Tuesday evening and that had been authorized before Wednesday morning. The 4 additional items were a motel keycard with a property name embossed on its plastic face, a motel in Morehead City on the mainland, a folded business card from a real estate office in Beaufort, North Carolina, a woman's silver bracelet with a small oval charm, and a man's class ring from a university whose name was engraved in the band, sized for a large hand, the stone a dark garnet red. None of the 4 items appeared in the Casper case record as belonging to either Noel or Adrienne. The motel key card and the business card and the bracelet and the class ring had belonged to other people who were not yet identified but whose possession of these items had apparently ended at a point prior to the item's arrival in the false column of a beach cottage crawl space on Pelican Shoal, and whose identity the expanded investigation would need to establish before the full meaning of the note's plural, things, the note's temporal claim, for a long time, could be understood with the specificity that the investigation required. Pell met Delia at Bet Cowan's at noon. They sat at the counter with coffee between them and the note's text in Pell's notebook open on the counter where both of them could see it. And they talked about the island in the specific way that investigations and journalism sometimes converged on a shared subject, each bringing to the conversation what the other's methodology could not access, Pell the forensic and institutional record, and Delia the community context, and the long accumulated knowledge of a place that her 8 years of covering cold cases in the region had produced. Bet Cowan moved along the counter's far end, not intrusively present, but not absent either. The movement of a person who is in her own space and who is listening in the way that people who have spent decades running establishments that served as community gathering points listened, with the comprehensive unobtrusiveness of someone who had heard most of the important conversations in a community pass through the space they occupied, and who understood that the hearing was a form of participation and the participation a form of responsibility. Pell asked Delia what she knew about the island's permanent residence in 2004 that was not in the official case record. Delia said she had spent her first evening on the island talking to Bet, and the second morning talking to the 3 other year-round residents she had been able to identify and approach in the 2 days since her arrival. She said what she had found was consistent with what she usually found in small island communities that had been the site of an unresolved disappearance, a community that had organized a collective memory of the event that was both highly detailed in its retention of specific particulars and carefully managed in its public expression. The management reflecting the protective instinct of a small population that had spent 20 years with the event as a permanent feature of its identity, and that had developed, across those 20 years, a set of implicit agreements about what was said and to whom and what was held back. She said the held-back material was not necessarily concealment in any culpable sense. It was more often the held-back material of a community that had learned, through 20 years of periodic outside attention, that certain things said to outsiders produced consequences in the community that were difficult to manage, and that the management of those consequences was sometimes more costly than the value of the saying. She said one of the things that appeared to be held back, based on the conversations she had had and the specific quality of the pauses and redirections she had noticed when certain directions of questioning were approached, was a discussion of access to the sound. Pell looked up from his notebook. She said that 3 of the 4 permanent residents she had spoken to had, at various points in their conversations with her, steered away from any extended discussion of the watercraft situation on the island's sound-facing side. Not dramatically. Not in a way that announced itself as avoidance. In the subtle and practiced way of people who had learned which directions of conversation to redirect and had been redirecting them for long enough that the redirection was nearly invisible. She said she had a name. She said it quietly, with the care of a journalist who understood the difference between an allegation and a finding, and who was positioned at the allegation stage and would not move beyond it without saying so clearly. The name she gave was Raymond Odell. She said Raymond Odell was 68 years old and had lived on Pelican Shoal since 1991, 13 years before the Caspers' disappearance, and had operated for most of that period as the island's primary property handyman, the person whom the realty office and the individual property owners called when something on a rental cottage needed fixing. He had therefore, across 13 years before the Caspers arrived and 20 years since, had routine access to every rental property on the island, including the cottage at the southern end, access that would have included the crawl space beneath it and the foundation structure whose false column had been found with its false latch and its carefully organized interior. She said she had found no specific evidence connecting Raymond Odell to the Caspers or to the false column or to anything that would constitute more than proximity and access. She said she was giving Pell the name because the investigation had the capacity to do with it what her journalism could not, which was to run it through every available database and cross-reference it against the 4 unidentified items in the zip-tied bundle and against any other records that the formal investigative apparatus could access and that journalism could not. Pell wrote the name in his notebook. He closed the notebook and looked at the counter between them, and then looked at Bet Cowan at the far end of the counter and found that Bet Cowan was not looking at him but was looking at the window and the sound visible through it. The same look she had given the window when she had told Delia that she had believed for 20 years that the Caspers had not left the island, and that whoever had taken them had known the island in the way of someone for whom it was not a map, but a body of accumulated personal understanding. He left Bet Cowan's and walked to his car and sat in it and ran Raymond Odell through the department's database before the engine was warm. The result came back in 4 minutes. Raymond Odell had no criminal record in North Carolina or in any adjacent state. He had a driver's license current through 2027. He had a vehicle registration for a pickup truck and a registration for a 17-foot aluminum skiff with an outboard motor, registered to a dock address on the island's sound-facing shore, a small private dock at the southern end of the island accessible from the western beach path through the shrub forest, 200 yards from the cottage where Noel and Adrienne Casper had made their coffee and had not drunk all of it. Pell looked at the skiff registration for a long time. Then he submitted an urgent request to the State Bureau for a full background investigation on Raymond Odell and called Terrell to ask whether the motel keycard, the business card, the bracelet, and the class ring had been run against any missing persons database yet. Terrell said they had. The class ring had returned a match. The class ring from the false column matched a missing persons report filed in the spring of 2001, 3 years before the Caspers arrived at Pelican Shoal. The report had been filed with the Dare County Sheriff's Department, 1 county north of Carteret on the North Carolina coast, by the wife of a man named Prescott Hayne, 41 years old, who had been reported missing after failing to return from a solo fishing trip off the Outer Banks on the 14th of April, 2001. His boat had been found drifting 6 miles offshore by the Coast Guard 3 days after his reported departure. Engine functional, personal effects including tackle and provisions aboard, Hayne himself absent. The Coast Guard had classified it as a presumed drowning after a search that covered the relevant maritime area over a period of 4 days without finding Hayne or any physical evidence of what had happened to him. The Dare County report had been closed in 2002 when the presumed drowning classification had been accepted by the county as the most probable explanation for a solo boat found adrift with its operator missing in open water, which was a classification that the maritime statistics of a single year off the North Carolina coast supported with a weight that made the alternative explanations feel unreasonably elaborate by comparison. His wife, a woman named June Hain, who was now 63, and who had moved from the Outer Banks to Raleigh in 2006 after the period of unresolved grief had become sufficiently incompatible with the place where the grief had begun, had accepted the presumed drowning with the specific resignation of a person who had been given a classification rather than an answer, and who had learned to inhabit the classification because the alternative was the open space of not knowing, which was not a place the mind could live in indefinitely. Pell called her on a Wednesday afternoon. She answered on the third ring in the tone of someone who received calls carefully, calibrating before speaking, the habit of a person for whom unexpected calls had carried weight before and who had learned to prepare before engaging. He identified himself and the case and told her about the ring with the full directness that the situation required, stating what had been found and where and the database match clearly and without cushioning that would have delayed the information past the point of useful preparation for it. She was quiet for 21 seconds, which Pell counted in his notebook because counting was what he did when a silence required patience and documentation simultaneously. Then she said, in a voice that was entirely controlled and that the control of it cost her something he could hear in the compression of it, that Prescott never went anywhere without that ring. She said he had worn it since his graduation from North Carolina State in 1984, and that the ring had been so much a part of his physical presence that she had sometimes thought of it as a fifth finger rather than an accessory. She said the Coast Guard had told her in 2001 that the absence of the ring on the drifting boat was consistent with the ring going into the water with him. She had believed this because the Coast Guard had said it, and because believing it was the only version of events that allowed the classification to hold. Pell asked her to tell him about the fishing trip of April 2001. He asked whether Prescott had a regular location for solo trips, whether the Outer Banks was his habitual territory or a destination he had varied. June said he had fished the same general area off the Outer Banks for 15 years, always solo, always with the same small boat, always departing from the same marina, and returning within a defined window that she had learned to trust as reliable because it had been reliable for 15 years without exception. She said the April trip had been the exception. She said she had understood within 12 hours of the expected return time that the exception was not a delay, but an absence, because 15 years of reliable behavior was not modified by a single unpredictable event, and the person who had maintained 15 years of reliable behavior in this specific domain was not a person who became unreliable without a cause. She said she had told the Coast Guard that his usual route did not take him as far south as where the boat had been found. She said the boat had been found 6 miles offshore of a location 30 miles south of the marina where he had departed, which meant the boat had drifted south or had been taken south and allowed to drift, and that the prevailing current patterns in the relevant period, which the Coast Guard's own oceanographic data had indicated, were not primarily southward at that time of year. She had raised this with the investigating officer and had been told that currents were variable and that the drift pattern was within the range of possible outcomes given the conditions. She had not been fully satisfied with this. She had said so at the time and had continued to say so across 23 years and had never had the satisfaction of the saying producing anything beyond the acknowledgement that her concern was noted. Pell thanked her and told her the investigation was now active and that he would keep her informed at every point where he was able to do so. He said it with the specific commitment of a person who understood what 23 years of not being kept informed had cost her and who intended to make the cost stop accruing immediately. He called Terrell next. He asked about the motel key card and the business card and the bracelet, whether any of them had returned database matches. Terrell said the motel key card had not produced a direct match because motel key cards were not individually logged in any database that persisted across 20 years. But she said the card's embossed property name, the motel in Morehead City, had been traced to an establishment that had operated under that name from 1993 through 2008, at which point it had closed and been converted to a different use. She said she had contacted the current owner of the property, who had retained some records from the motel operation in a storage unit and who had agreed to provide access to those records. The bracelet had returned a partial match against a missing persons database entry from 2002. A woman named Cecily Drum, 36 years old, reported missing from Beaufort, North Carolina, by her sister after she failed to appear for a family function she had confirmed her attendance at. The report had been filed with the Carteret County Sheriff's Department, which meant it had been filed with the same department that Pell worked for, and he had pulled the file before the call with Terrell was finished. The file was thin. Cecily Drum had been a bookkeeper employed by a marine supply company in Beaufort. She had been single and had lived alone in an apartment in the town's historic district. The investigation had found no evidence of voluntary departure and no evidence of what else might have happened. No witness accounts, no physical evidence, no financial activity after the date of her disappearance. The case had been reviewed once in 2005 and had been classified as an open cold case with insufficient evidence to pursue active investigation. The missing person's photograph in the file showed a woman with dark hair and a round face and the particular direct quality of expression of someone who had been asked to hold still for a photograph and who was complying with equanimity. Looking at the camera without self-consciousness, the expression of a person at ease with being looked at. Around her wrist in the photograph, visible at the lower edge of the frame in the casual way of an accessory worn so habitually that its presence was not thought about, was a bracelet, a silver chain with a small oval charm. Pell looked at the photograph for a long time. Then he looked at the evidence photograph of the bracelet from the false column, the silver chain with the small oval charm arranged in the curved position of something that had been placed rather than dropped, laid with a deliberateness that the photograph communicated in the way that photographs sometimes communicated intention in the arrangement of objects. He set both photographs side by side on the conference table in the island's small municipal office that had been made available to the department for the investigation, and he looked at the two images and thought about the note's plural and its temporal claim, and about a man named Prescott Hayne, whose ring was in a false column, and a woman named Cecily Drum, whose bracelet was in the same false column, and a couple named Noel and Adrienne Casper, whose driver's license and library card were in the same false column, and about what the false column was, which was a record, a deliberate and organized record of presences that had ended at the point of their inclusion in the column's interior, the same proprietary documentation that investigators in other cases had found in other states in other containers, the same curatorial impulse applied to the same purpose in the same private and self-referential logic of a person who understood their relationship to other people as the relationship of a collector to a collection. The business card from the real estate office in Beaufort had not yet returned a database match. It was a standard business card, cream-colored with blue text, bearing the name of the office and a handwritten notation on its reverse in what the handwriting unit had identified as a different hand from the note found in the plastic sleeve. A different hand that had written on the back of the card a name and a phone number, the name being a first name only, a woman's name, and the phone number being a prefix consistent with a Beaufort area code from the early 2000s. The name written on the back of the business card was Cecily. Pell ran the phone number. It was a landline registered to a residential address in Beaufort, North Carolina. The subscriber was Cecily Drum. The number had been disconnected in 2003, the year after her disappearance, when the account had lapsed for non-payment in the way of accounts belonging to people who were no longer in a position to pay them. He sat in the municipal office on Pelican Shoal with the two photographs side by side on the conference table, and the business card and the class ring photograph alongside them, and the note in his notebook open to the page where he had written the last sentence verbatim. I have been giving it things for a long time, and it has kept them well. He looked at the word things. He looked at the word long. He looked at the word kept, and at the word well, and at the word it, which referred to the island. The island keeps what it is given, and he thought about what a person meant when they said the island keeps what it is given, as if the island were a participant rather than a location, as if the relationship between the person and the island were the relationship of two parties to an arrangement, both of them holding up their end. He thought about Raymond Odell and his 17-foot aluminum skiff on its private dock at the southern end of the island, 200 yards from the cottage where coffee had gone cold in 2 mugs on a September morning in 2004. He thought about 1991, the year Raymond Odell had moved to Pelican Shoal, and about what the note meant when it said for a long time, and about how long a long time was, and about what the island might have been given and asked to keep in the years before the motel key card and the bracelet and the class ring, in the years before Cecily Drum and Prescott Hayne, in the years of Raymond Odell's first decade on the island when the investigation was not yet looking, and the island had been keeping whatever it had been given without anyone yet knowing to ask. He opened a new page in his notebook. He wrote the year 1991 at the top and drew a line beneath it. Then he picked up his phone and called the State Bureau's Missing Persons Archive Unit and asked them to run every unresolved disappearance within the coastal geography of Carteret County and the surrounding counties from 1991 through 2004. He said he wanted to know specifically about any disappearances connected to maritime activity, recreational boating, beach properties, or coastal access points. He said he wanted the full list, regardless of how the cases had been classified, because he was beginning to think that some of the classifications were wrong and that a list organized around the correct classification would look quite different from the list that currently existed. The archive unit said it would take until morning. Pell said morning was fine. He closed his notebook and walked out of the municipal office into the Pelican Shoal afternoon, the island's single-paved road quiet in both directions, the sound visible to the west through the gap in the shrub forest and the ocean audible from the east, and he stood between the two bodies of water and thought about an island that had been keeping things for a long time and about how many things a long time on an island of 3.5 miles could mean. The archive unit's response arrived at 6:47 on a Thursday morning, delivered to Pell's department email as a formatted document that he opened on his laptop at the small table in his room at Bet Cowan's establishment. The sound visible through the window in the pale early light of a coastal morning, the water flat and gray in the way it was flat and gray before the sun had cleared the island's eastern ridge and brought the color back into it. The list covered the period from 1991 through 2004 and the geographic area he had specified, Carteret County and the 4 surrounding coastal counties, filtered for disappearances connected to maritime activity, beach properties, and coastal access. The raw list before filtering had contained 61 entries. After the geographic and thematic filter, it contained 22. He read through the 22 with the careful attention of someone reading for pattern rather than for individual case detail, looking for the shape that the cases made collectively rather than what each one said separately. 11 of the 22 had classifications of presumed drowning or maritime accident, which was the classification that the coastal geography generated with a regularity that made it the default explanation for any disappearance in which water was a proximate feature of the setting. Of those 11, 7 had been closed on the basis of the maritime classification without recovered remains, which in a coastal environment was consistent with the physics of what happened to bodies in open water over time, but was also, as Pell had understood since before he could articulate it precisely, a classification that could carry cases that were not what they appeared to be, cases whose classification reflected the convenience of an available explanation rather than the weight of the evidence. 6 of the 7 closed maritime presumptions involved individuals who had been engaged in solo or small group water activities in the coastal areas within a radius that, when Pell plotted the originating locations on a map of the region, produced a distribution that was not random. The 6 originating locations were spread across the geographic area the list covered, but they clustered, when he looked at the cluster, rather than the individual points, along a corridor that ran roughly parallel to the Barrier Island chain, the coastal geography that Pelican Shoal occupied, in the way that a distribution cluster sometimes revealed the operating range of something that had not yet been identified as having an operating range. He plotted the dates alongside the locations. The earliest entry in the cluster was from 1992, 1 year after Raymond Odell had moved to Pelican Shoal. The most recent entry before the Caspers was from 2003, 1 year before the Caspers arrived. The entries were spaced at intervals of between 14 months and 2.5 years, the spacing of events that were not planned on a fixed schedule, but that recurred within a consistent temporal range, the intervals of something that happened when the conditions for it were met rather than when a calendar designated. 6 presumed maritime drownings across 12 years along a coastal corridor centered on a barrier island, where a man with a private dock and a 17-foot aluminum skiff had been living since 1991 and had been operating as the primary property handyman for the island's rental stock across that entire period. He made 2 calls before he ate breakfast. The first was to Terrell at the State Bureau Lab, asking her to cross-reference the 6 case files against the unidentified items that remained in the bundle from the false column, the motel key card and the real estate business card, and any additional items whose connection had not yet been established. The second was to the department's records unit, asking for the full files on the 6 cases rather than the summary entries in the archive list. Then he ate breakfast at Bet Cowan's counter and thought about the list while Bet moved along the far end of the counter in her quiet and comprehensive way, not absent from the conversation, but not inserting herself into it. Present in the way she was always present in the space she ran, the presence of someone whose establishment was the community's ambient gathering point and who had absorbed, across 20 years of running it, a great deal of information about the community that she had never been asked to organize into anything useful. He asked her, setting his fork down and looking at her directly in the way that indicated the question was purposeful rather than conversational, whether she had any knowledge of incidents on the water in the years since she had been running the establishment. Not the Caspers specifically. Anything. Any disappearance or accident or unexplained absence connected to the water access on the island's sound side or the ocean side. Bet stopped moving. She set down the cloth she had been using on the counter and folded her hands on its surface and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for a specific question for a specific number of years and who was now determining whether the question that had arrived was the one she had been waiting for or a version of it that required clarification before she answered. She said, "How far back?" He said, "As far back as she could go." She said she had been running the establishment since 2004, which was the same year as the Caspers, and that before that, she had been working here under the previous proprietor since 1998, and that before that, she had grown up on the island and had lived on it since birth, with the exception of 4 years of college in Greenville and a subsequent year in Charlotte that had confirmed for her that the island was where she belonged and to which she had returned in 1992. She said she was going to tell him something she had not told the investigators in 2004. She said she had not told them because they had not asked in the way he was asking, which was the way that suggested they already understood that the thing being asked about was a thing rather than a speculation, that the asking was not an exploratory gesture, but a directed one. The 2004 investigators had asked in the exploratory way, the way of people who do not yet know what they are looking for and are hoping that asking broadly will produce something specific. He was asking in the specific way, and the specific way unlocked a different quality of answer. In the spring of 2001, she said, a man had come into the establishment asking about recreational kayaking on the sound side of the island. He had been staying in one of the northern rentals for a long weekend, a solo visitor, middle-aged, who had introduced himself to her by a name she no longer remembered, but who had spoken to her for perhaps 20 minutes over a coffee about the Sound's tidal patterns and the best access points for a single kayak. He had been interested specifically in the southern access point, the western beach path through the shrub forest, and she had described it to him as she described it to anyone who asked, as the easiest Sound side access from the southern properties. She had not seen him again after that morning conversation. She had thought nothing of it at the time, because visitors asking about water access was a weekly occurrence in the warmer months, and the conversation had been ordinary in every respect. She had thought about it for the first time in the summer of 2001, when a Coast Guard notification had circulated among the island's establishments, asking whether anyone had information about a man whose boat had been found adrift 30 miles south of the Outer Banks in April. The notification had included a photograph. She had looked at the photograph and had experienced a specific and particular recognition that she had immediately questioned because a 20-minute conversation over a coffee 4 months prior was not the basis for a confident identification, and because the notification was about a boat found offshore and the man in her establishment had been asking about kayaking on the Sound side, and the connection between those two things was not obvious. She had not called the number on the notification. She had thought about it and had decided that what she had was not sufficient to be useful and had set it aside. She had thought about it again in 2004 when the Caspers disappeared and had made the same calculation and had reached the same conclusion and had set it aside again. She had thought about it a third time when Delia Marsh had arrived on the island and had been asking about watercraft access, and she had set it aside a third time because 2 decades of setting it aside had created a habit that the arrival of Delia's questions had not fully broken. The question Pell had asked this morning had broken it. He asked her if the notification had named the man whose boat was found adrift. She said she believed the name on the notification had been Hayne. She said it the way people said names they had retained in a specific memory for 23 years, with the careful confidence of something that had been stored without being used, and that was therefore possibly exactly right or possibly slightly wrong in the way of stored things. Pell wrote Prescott Hayne in his notebook and looked at the name and at the timeline and at the list of 6 maritime presumptions and at the motel keycard and the bracelet and the class ring in their evidence photographs on the table alongside his laptop, and he thought about a man asking about the southern access point to the Soundside Beach on Pelican Shoal 4 months before his boat was found drifting 30 miles south of the Outer Banks, and about how a man who had departed from a marina north of the Outer Banks had ended up represented by a class ring in a false foundation column on a barrier island 30 miles south of where his boat was found. He thought about a 17-foot aluminum skiff with an outboard motor on a private dock at the southern end of the island, and about the Sound at night, and about what the Sound's tidal patterns would support in terms of movement and transit, and the kind of crossing that did not generate a manifest. He thanked Bet and left money on the counter and walked outside into the morning where the light had cleared the island's eastern ridge and the color had come back into the Sound, and the water was moving in the small rhythmic patterns of a body of water entirely sufficient for the purpose of a 17-foot aluminum skiff whose operator knew its tidal behavior with the comprehensive intimacy of someone who had been crossing it at night for more than 30 years. He walked to the municipal office and called the department and asked for a surveillance unit to be positioned near the private dock at the southern end of the island before the day's end. He said he did not want Raymond Odell approached or alerted. He said he wanted to know the skiff's movements and specifically whether the skiff moved at night and in what direction and at what intervals. He said he thought it was time to understand what the island had been given and what it had been asked to keep and where it had been keeping it, and that the skiff and the Sound and the southern dock were the mechanism by which those things were connected, and that watching the mechanism was the next thing the investigation required. The surveillance unit confirmed its positioning at 4 that afternoon. 2 officers in a rented property with a sound-facing window that gave a clear line of sight to the dock and its skiff from a distance of approximately 150 yards. Pell received their confirmation and sat with the case file and the archive list and the evidence photographs as the island's afternoon gave way to its evening, the light going gold and then gone, the Sound darkening from its daytime color to the particular opacity of Sound water at night, dark and still and entirely capable of keeping what it was given. The surveillance unit reported at 2:17 on a Friday morning that the skiff had left the private dock at the southern end of Pelican Shoal, heading southwest across the Sound. The reporting officer described the departure as practiced in its economy. No light used on the dock. The engine started at a low throttle that was consistent with someone who had made this departure many times and who had calibrated the starting procedure to minimize the sound it produced. The skiff moving away from the dock and across the Sound in the direction of the mainland shore at a pace that the officer estimated as approximately 15 knots, the pace of a craft moving purposefully rather than leisurely in the dark. Pell was on the phone within 90 seconds of the report. He was dressed and at the municipal office within 8 minutes and on the phone with the department's Marine Patrol unit within 9. He gave the heading and the time of departure and the vessel description, and asked for a Marine Patrol intercept on the Sound at a point that would place the intercept between the skiff's last known position and the mainland shore, far enough from the island to be beyond Raymond Odell's immediate sightline, but close enough to the mainland to establish that the crossing was underway rather than incomplete. He did not want the intercept at the dock on the island side because the dock was the location the investigation needed to examine, and examining it required a forensic team and a warrant, and the time for both to be assembled, and the examination needed to happen before Raymond Odell had the opportunity to return to the dock and to whatever the dock and its surroundings represented in the geography of what the island had been asked to keep. The Marine Patrol intercept was achieved at 3:41 in the morning on the open water of Pamlico Sound at a point approximately 3 miles from the Pelican Shoal shore and 2 miles from the mainland. The Marine Patrol vessel used its lights and its radio on the channel that recreational boaters monitored, and the skiff slowed and stopped without apparent attempt to evade, which Pell noted when the intercept officers called in their report as either evidence that Odell had not understood the implications of the intercept or evidence that he had understood them and had made the same calculation that other people in other investigations had made when the arrival of something they had been anticipating finally came. The calculation of a person who had decided that the coming of it was the next thing, and that evasion was not the response that the next thing required. The intercept officers reported that Raymond Odell was the sole occupant of the skiff. They reported that he was cooperative and calm. They reported that the skiff's cargo included 2 plastic storage containers of the sealed variety used for waterproof storage of equipment and supplies. The containers secured to the skiff's floor with tie-down straps of the kind used for exactly this purpose on working watercraft. The containers were sealed and locked with combination locks. The intercept officers had asked Odell to open them, and he had said, in the quiet and unhurried voice that would subsequently be described by every officer who interacted with him across the following weeks as the most consistent characteristic of his presentation, that he would like to speak with a lawyer before he opened anything. He was brought to the mainland and held at the Carteret County facility while the Marine Patrol documented the skiff and its contents, and the department's warrant application for the skiff's sealed containers was submitted to the duty judge at 4:15 in the morning. The warrant was issued at 5:40, and the containers were opened at 6:20 by the Marine Patrol officers in the presence of the duty forensic technician who had been called in when the intercept report had been received by the department. Pell arrived at the Marine facility at 6:50, 20 minutes after the containers were opened, and was briefed by the duty forensic technician, a young woman named Priya Anand, who was thorough and had the particular steadiness of a technician who had been on call through the night and who was managing the compound tiredness of a long shift and the weight of what the containers had produced with the professional composure that the situation required. She said the first container held items consistent with watercraft maintenance and navigation, a GPS unit, a tide chart for Pamlico Sound, a waterproof flashlight, a coil of marine rope, a small tool roll. She said none of these items were individually remarkable for a person operating a small watercraft on the Sound at night. She said the GPS unit's track history was a different matter and that she had logged it as primary evidence and had submitted it to the digital forensics unit for full extraction of its stored route data. She said the second container held items that were not consistent with watercraft maintenance and navigation. The second container held 7 small plastic bags, each sealed with tape and each containing items whose character she described with the flat precision of someone who had been trained to describe evidence in terms of what it demonstrably was rather than what it suggested, and whose maintenance of that discipline in this moment required the visible effort of a person imposing professional language over a personal response. Each bag contained items of a personal character, she said. Jewelry, identification documents, small objects of the kind that people carried habitually or wore daily, or kept close in the way of things that were not practically valuable but were personally significant. Each bag was labeled with a date in a handwriting she had photographed and logged as consistent with the handwriting on the note found in the false column. 7 bags. 7 dates spanning from 1992 through 2003. Pell looked at the 7 bags in their evidence tray and thought about the archive list's 6 maritime presumptions across 12 years, and about the 7th entry that the list had not yet produced, and about the interval between 1992 and 2003, and about the false column and its 4 items from 2001 through 2004, and about the note that said, "I have been giving it things for a long time, and the island has kept them well." The 7 bags were what had been given before the false column. The false column had been the most recent repository, and the 7 bags had been the practice of the method before the column existed. the earlier system for the same curatorial impulse stored in the containers and transported across the Sound to a location on the mainland that the GPS unit's route history would establish with the precision of digital navigation data applied to a question that analog investigation had been unable to answer across 30 years. He asked Anand whether the GPS routes went to a consistent location on the mainland shore. She said the full extraction was not yet complete, but the preliminary review of the stored routes showed multiple crossings to the same general area of the mainland shore, a section of the Carteret County coastline south of Beaufort that was largely undeveloped, a stretch of shoreline consisting of maritime grassland and the shallow intertidal zone of the Sound's western bank, accessible from the mainland by a single unpaved road that terminated at the waterline at a point where small watercraft could be beached for loading and unloading. The area was not a marina or a public boat launch. It was a private shoreline without any commercial or residential development within a half-mile in either direction. A person who knew it was there and who had been using it for 30 years would have found it. Across those 30 years, a location whose isolation from casual observation was as reliable as the Sound's tidal patterns and as predictable and as suited to the purpose of a crossing that did not need to be seen. Pell requested an immediate forensic survey of the mainland shoreline location from the department's ground unit and a coordinating survey of the surrounding area by the State Bureau's team that had been deployed for the Casper investigation. And that was now, as of this morning, operating in a context considerably broader than a single couple's disappearance from a beach rental cottage in September of 2004. He drove to the Carteret County facility where Raymond Odell was being held and sat across from him in an interview room that was the plain institutional space of a county facility, fluorescent lit and sparsely furnished, and carrying the particular atmosphere of a room that had been used for important conversations across a long period and that had absorbed the weight of them in the way that rooms absorbed the weight of what happened in them without showing it on the surface. Odell was 68 years old and looked his age in the specific way that people who had spent decades in the outdoor life of a coastal environment looked their age, weathered and lean and entirely at ease in his body, in the way of someone who had used his body as a working tool for a long time and who had developed a relationship to its capacities that was practical rather than self-conscious. He sat with his hands on the table and his eyes on the space in front of him with the interior composure that the Intercept officers had described. The composure that was not performed, but was the settled quality of a man who had arrived at a relationship with this moment across 30 years of knowing it was theoretically possible, and who had decided, in the particular way that some people decided, that the arriving of it was simply what had come next. His lawyer had arrived at the facility at 7:40 and had spent 40 minutes with Odell before Pell was permitted to begin the interview. The lawyer, a Beaufort attorney named Carl Sesto, who was competent and careful and who had the resigned professional dignity of a lawyer who understood what his client's situation was and who intended to provide the best available legal representation to a situation that was not going to be improved by representation, emerged from the 40 minutes and told Pell that his client was prepared to make a statement. Pell entered the room and identified himself and stated the formal terms of the conversation. Odell listened with the focused attention of someone who had thought about this conversation for a very long time and who was measuring its actual shape against the shape he had imagined. Then Odell asked Pell one question before he spoke. He asked whether the forensic team had been to the mainland shore yet. Pell said yes. Odell nodded once, the nod of a man confirming a calculation he had already made. Then he said he would tell Pell where to look and what they would find, and that he would ask only that. When it was found, it was treated with the respect that a person deserved regardless of the circumstances under which they had come to be where they were, because the island had kept what it had been given with the respect that a keeper owed to what was entrusted to it, and he had extended the same respect to what the mainland shore had been asked to hold, and he wanted that understood before anything else was established. Pell looked at him across the interview table in the fluorescent light of the Carteret County facility and said he would do his best to ensure that. Odell looked at the table for a long moment. Then he began. The forensic survey of the mainland shoreline location had been underway for 3 hours by the time Odell finished his statement in the interview room at the Carteret County facility. Pell had listened without interrupting, making notes in the careful and minimal way he made notes when an account required full attention and the documentation could wait for the account to complete itself. And when Odell stopped speaking, Pell sat with what had been said for the length of time it required before he spoke in return. The account covered 32 years. It began in 1991, when Raymond Odell had arrived on Pelican Shoal from a previous residence in Onslow County. Having concluded, he said without elaboration that Pell did not press for, that the geography of a barrier island accessible only by ferry offered a quality of boundary that the mainland geography did not. He had secured the handyman position with the island's realty office within his first month, a position for which his practical skills in property maintenance were genuinely suited, and which had provided, across the subsequent 32 years, a legitimate professional reason for his presence on every rental property on the island, including the crawl spaces of the raised foundation cottages that were the standard construction of the island's rental stock. He had built the false column in the cottage at the southern end in 2002, 2 years before the Caspers arrived, using materials he had sourced incrementally through his legitimate property maintenance work so that no single purchase was anomalous in the context of a person whose work regularly required concrete block and timber and hardware. He had built it as a repository for items that had previously been stored in the waterproof containers on the skiff, a transition from a mobile storage system to a fixed one that he described as a decision motivated by what he called security of keeping. The desire for permanence in the keeping of what he kept, that the containers on a watercraft did not provide in the way that a fixed structure within a building could provide. He had described the Caspers' arrival at the cottage without being asked, because the account was organized in the chronological logic of someone who had decided to give the full account, and who understood that the Caspers were the beginning of the end of the account rather than the end of the beginning. He said they had arrived on a Saturday, and he had not known they were coming. He said the cottage had been between rental periods in his understanding of the cottage's occupancy, which was the intimate and continuous understanding of a man who had maintained the property for years and who tracked its occupancy with the proprietary attention of someone for whom the cottage was a fixed feature of a geography he considered his in the sense that mattered to him. He said the Caspers had not been planned. He said this with the same flat delivery he brought to everything, as a statement of operational fact rather than as a mitigation of what the statement was adjacent to, and Pell received it in the same spirit, as information rather than as an argument, and wrote it in his notebook without response. He said he would tell Pell where the mainland shore held what it held and what the GPS routes had been going to and what the survey would find if it looked in the right places and in the right sequence. He said the right sequence mattered because the shore was a natural environment, and natural environments organized what they held in the way of natural environments, with the logic of water and sediment and the seasonal patterns of a coastal shoreline rather than the logic of human arrangement, and finding what was there required understanding the shore's own organization rather than imposing a search grid that the shore's logic would defeat. He provided the sequence. He provided it in the specific and geographic language of someone who knew a shoreline the way a person knew a shoreline that they had been visiting across 30 years in the dark, by feel and by the sound of the water and by the particular qualities of each section of it that distinguished it from the sections adjacent, the way a person knew a room in their own house in the dark without needing light because the knowledge was in the body rather than in the eyes. Pell relayed the sequence to the survey team by phone before he left the facility and drove to the mainland shoreline location himself, arriving in the mid-morning to find the State Bureau's forensic team deployed across the shoreline in the configuration that the department's ground unit had established in the initial survey hours, a configuration that the sequence Odell had provided would require to be partially reorganized. He met the survey team's lead, a State Bureau senior investigator named Delphine Osei, who had been coordinating with Terrell's lab work, and who had the combined fatigue and alertness of someone who had been on an active investigation for a week, and who was now at the point in it where the accumulation of evidence had reached a mass sufficient to make the weight of it fully present in the working day, present in every decision about where to look and how to look, and what the looking meant. He gave her the sequence. She listened and reorganized the team's configuration, and the survey resumed in the adjusted pattern. the team working the shoreline from south to north in the specific order that Odell's knowledge of the shore's logic had indicated, and within the first hour of the adjusted survey, the ground-penetrating radar unit had identified the first subsurface feature at a depth consistent with what the coastal soil conditions and the seasonal patterns of the intertidal zone would produce over the time periods the account had established. The forensic excavation process that followed was conducted across 4 days, organized around the tide patterns that Odell had described as the primary governing factor in the shoreline's organization of what it held, the twice-daily tidal cycle that moved the waterline across the shore and that had, across 30 years, worked with the sedimentary processes of the Sound's western bank to distribute what the shore had received in the pattern of a natural process rather than the pattern of a human one. Pell was present for all 4 days. He stood at the perimeter of the excavation areas and watched the forensic team work with the patient precision that the material required and that the people whose remains the material represented deserved. And he thought across those 4 days about the note and about the island and about what it meant for a person to have organized an understanding of geography around the concept of keeping, to have developed a relationship with a landscape in which the landscape was a participant in the keeping rather than a passive setting for it, to have said the island keeps what it is given as if this were a quality of the island rather than a consequence of what the person had done with the island's geography. He thought about Noel and Adrienne Casper and their coffee mugs and their ferry tickets and their map with 3 beaches circled in blue ink. He thought about the delayed honeymoon and the year they had finally saved the money and made the time and driven to the ferry terminal at Cedar Point on a Saturday morning with a week's worth of hope and had arrived at an island where someone had already organized the geography around the keeping of things and people who had not been planned for and had come to the wrong cottage at the wrong time. He thought about what wrong time meant in the private vocabulary of a person who believed that the distinction between the times was a distinction between what was planned and what was not, as if planning were the moral category rather than the act itself, as if the absence of planning created a different kind of account than the presence of it, and the different kind of account was somehow less than the planned one, as if the Caspers deserved a different quality of consideration than the others, because they had arrived at the wrong moment in a wrong that had been operating continuously for 12 years before they arrived. On the 4th day of the excavation, Delphine Osei came to where Pell was standing at the perimeter and briefed him on the full scope of what the 4 days had produced. The formal enumeration of the forensic findings in the careful and qualified language of a scientist whose discipline required precision about what could be established and what remained to be established by the subsequent analysis of the laboratory. The briefing was 12 minutes long. Pell did not take notes during it. He listened with the full attention that 12 minutes of a certain kind of information required, and he did not look away from Osei while she spoke. And when she finished, he thanked her and walked to the water's edge of the shoreline and stood there for a few minutes with the Sound moving around his feet in the shallow intertidal zone. The water warm from the September sun, the mainland shore stretching north and south in the quiet of a coastal morning that was entirely ordinary and entirely insufficient for what it was being asked to hold. He called Delia Marsh. She answered on the 2nd ring. He said he thought she should come to the mainland shore. She said she was already on the mainland, having taken the morning ferry, and asked where on the shore he was. He gave her the location, and she was there in 20 minutes, parking behind the forensic vehicles on the unpaved road and walking the path to the waterline where Pell was standing. She looked at the excavation areas marked with their evidence flags in the morning light, and then she looked at Pell, and then she looked at the water. He told her what the 4 days had produced. She listened without speaking until he had finished. Then she said how many, and he told her, and she was quiet for the length of time that a number of that size required before it could be responded to. The silence of a journalist who had spent 8 years covering cases in which numbers like that did not appear, and who was now standing at the water's edge of a coastal shoreline in North Carolina in September, understanding that this was not the kind of case she had covered before, and that the covering of it was going to require everything she had. He left her at the shoreline and drove back toward Beaufort, the mainland road running between the coastal marsh and the pine upland in the particular quality of a North Carolina coastal morning that had no interest in the weight of what the morning contained. the light generous, and the air still warm from the summer that was technically over, but that the coast retained longer than the calendar acknowledged, and he drove through it thinking about the GPS routes on Raymond Odell's navigation unit, and about what 32 years of crossings across a body of water at night looked like when the full data of them was extracted and displayed as a record of movement. He thought about the sound keeping what it had been asked to keep, and about how much a body of water could hold, and how long it could hold it, and about the particular patience of natural processes applied to the keeping of things across decades, patient in the way of things that had no consciousness of what they were doing and therefore no limit to their capacity to do it. He thought about Bet Cowan and the 2 coffee mugs she had thought about across 20 years, and about how the mugs had been the object through which the unresolvable weight of the Casper disappearance had been carried in her mind, the small concrete detail that anchored the large unresolvable one. He thought about what she would carry now that the unresolvable had been resolved into something specific and terrible and permanent, what the object would be now that the weight had a shape and a name and a number attached to it. He thought that it was probably still the mugs, that the mugs were the right object for the weight regardless of how much the weight grew, because the mugs were the moment before everything after them, and what was before was sometimes more permanently present in the memory than what came after. The last ordinary thing carrying more weight than all the extraordinary things that followed it. The 2 mugs with their partial coffee in the kitchen of a beach cottage on a barrier island being the most specific and irreducible fact of a case that would now expand to fill a scope that the mugs' domestic ordinariness could not have suggested on the September morning in 2004 when Cecile Odom had found them on the counter and had understood, in the way of a person who knew a cottage and knew a couple's departure and could tell the difference between a cleaning and an absence, that something was wrong. The charges against Raymond Odell were filed in the 3rd week of September 2024 in the Federal District Court with jurisdiction over the multi-county coastal geography that the investigation had established as the operational range of what the prosecutor's office designated, in its formal charging language, as a pattern of criminal conduct spanning a period of not less than 32 years and encompassing the full scope of the forensic findings from the Pelican Shoal property and the Pamlico Sound shoreline. The charges were extensive. Their scope reflected the 4-day forensic survey of the mainland shore and the subsequent laboratory analysis that had been conducted across 6 weeks following the survey, analysis that had applied the full capacity of the State Bureau's Forensic Science Division to the material the survey had produced, and that had generated a formal findings report of 247 pages, the longest forensic report Pell had been associated with in 26 years of Carteret County law enforcement. The formal identification process was conducted in parallel with the laboratory analysis and took longer. The identification of individuals from material that had been subject to the tidal and sedimentary processes of a coastal shoreline across periods ranging from 3 years to 32, requiring the forensic methodologies available in 2024 to work at the edge of their practical application, producing results that were qualified in the formal language of scientific confidence intervals, but that were, in the cases where identification was achieved, as definitive as the material allowed. Noel and Adrienne Casper were identified within the first 2 weeks of the laboratory analysis. Their families were notified before any public statement was made. Noel's mother, a woman named Patricia Casper, who was 71 and who had spent 20 years in the particular suspended state of a parent whose child's absence has no formal conclusion, received the notification from Pell in person at her home in Raleigh on a Monday afternoon in late September, and sat with it for a long time in the way of someone receiving confirmation of something they had known in the formless and unconfirmed way of long grief, and who was now being offered the formal version, the version with dates and locations and the weight of institutional certainty behind it. She asked Pell whether Noel had been with Adrienne. He said yes. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she opened them and said that was good. She said it with the quiet conviction of a person for whom the only available comfort in an uncomforting set of facts was the fact of the togetherness, and who was taking that comfort without apology because it was what was available, and she had not been in a position to be selective about comfort for 20 years. Adrienne's family, her parents, and her younger brother, who had been 9 years old when Adrienne and Noel had driven to Cedar Point on a Saturday morning, and who was now 31, and who had grown up alongside the absence of his sister in the way that younger siblings sometimes grew up alongside an absence that was too large and too early to be fully processed, and that therefore became a permanent feature of the landscape of childhood, rather than a discrete event within it, were notified by a family liaison officer on the same day, and received the notification with the particular response of people who had been carrying something that now had a different weight, not lighter but differently configured. The weight of knowing replacing the weight of not knowing in the way that one kind of heaviness replaced another, without the replacing being a relief in the conventional sense. The 6 maritime presumptions on the archive list were resolved across the following weeks as the laboratory analysis produced identifications that matched 5 of the 6 against missing persons records that had been open since the 1990s and the early 2000s. The 6th was identified through DNA comparison against a family database rather than a missing persons record, the identification producing a new case file for a disappearance that had not been formally reported because the person had been isolated enough from family contact at the time of their disappearance that the absence had not generated the immediate alarm that would have produced a report, and the absence had eventually been attributed by the few people who had known the person to the voluntary departure that isolated people sometimes undertook when they decided to reorganize their lives in a direction that did not include the people who had known the previous version. The 7 bags from the skiff containers were matched against the identifications and the archive list cases and the additional findings from the mainland shore with the careful cross-referencing that the laboratory's documentation unit produced. The matching of personal items to identified individuals being part of the formal record that the prosecution required and that the families deserved as the most specific possible confirmation that the person they had lost was accounted for in the investigation's understanding of what had happened. The class ring was matched to Prescott Hayne. June Hayne received the confirmation from the Dare County Sheriff's Department, which coordinated with Pell's investigation for the notifications in the cases that fell within its jurisdiction on a Thursday afternoon. She called Pell directly afterward, having obtained his number from the notification officer, and said she wanted him to know that she had raised the question of the boat's drift pattern in 2001 and had been told it was within the range of possible outcomes given the conditions. She said she wanted that in the record. Pell said it would be in the record. She said thank you and ended the call. The bracelet was matched to Cecily Drum. Her sister, the person who had filed the original missing persons report in 2002, received the notification and said to the notification officer that she had never believed the voluntary departure explanation and had said so at the time and would appreciate it if that was also in the record. The trial of Raymond Odell opened in the Federal District Court in New Bern in the spring of 2025. It ran for 22 days. Pell testified across 3 of them, delivering the investigative record in the organized sequence that the prosecution had built from the contractor's inspection to the false column, to the GPS routes, to the shore survey, to the laboratory findings. The full architecture of a 32-year case assembled in the chronological logic of its discovery rather than the chronological logic of its commission, which was the logic that the evidence supported most fully and that the jury received with the sustained attention of 12 people who had been selected for their capacity to hold a large and complex account across 22 days without losing the thread of what the account was fundamentally about. Delia Marsh sat in the gallery for every session. She sat in the second row with her notebook across her knees and wrote in the way she wrote during trials, the structured documentation of an investigative journalist whose work was organized around the formal record as the evidentiary foundation of everything else, but with the additional layer of the observational and the contextual that the formal record did not contain, and that the gallery of a courtroom sometimes made visible to someone looking for it. She wrote about the prosecution's presentation of the GPS route data, which had been converted into a visual display showing 32 years of crossings across Pamlico Sound as a pattern of light on dark water. Each route a line from the island dock to the mainland shore, the accumulated lines building over the displayed time period into a network of crossings that communicated, in the visual language of data made geographic, the scale and the regularity of a practice that had been sustained across 3 decades without detection. She wrote about Odell in the defendant's chair, his posture and his stillness, and the quality of his engagement with the proceedings, which was the quality of someone attending something that was happening to the record rather than to him, watching the formal construction of a case against the history he had already provided in the interview room at the Carteret County facility, with the detached interest of a person who has already accepted the account and is now observing its translation into the institutional language that the system required. She wrote about the families in the gallery who attended in rotation across the 22 days, each family present for different sessions and sometimes for the same ones, creating across the trial a sustained familial presence in the gallery that was the human context for the forensic and investigative record being constructed on the courtroom floor, the presence of the people for whom the record was being assembled visible above it and distinct from it, but inseparable from the meaning of it. He was convicted on all applicable counts. The federal judge who delivered the sentence did so on a Tuesday morning in August of 2025, in the plain and weighted language of federal sentencing, multiple consecutive terms that reflected the scope of what had been established and that would retain Odell within the federal system for the remainder of a life that had organized itself around the geography of an island and a sound and a mainland shore for 32 years. Odell received the sentence in the same stillness he had brought to everything since the Marine Patrol vessel had put its lights on in the dark water of Pamlico Sound at 3:41 on a Friday morning in September, and he had slowed the skiff and stopped. He looked forward throughout the sentencing and did not speak, and was led from the courtroom with the economy of movement that had always characterized him, the body of a man who had spent 32 years in the practical outdoor work of an island community and who moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had never wasted a motion in his working life. Pell sat in the gallery for the sentencing. He had not been required to be present and had chosen to be, in the same way he had chosen to be present on the mainland shore across 4 days of forensic survey, and in the same way he had driven back to Pelican Shoal on the Sunday after the arrest to walk the island's road from the northern terminal to the southern end one more time, and to stand at the access panel of the crawl space below the cottage, and to stand at the western beach path through the shrub forest, and to stand at the private dock at the southern end with the sound around him in the late afternoon light of a September day that was the same September light as the September day 20 years earlier when 2 people had arrived at a ferry terminal with a map with 3 beaches circled in blue ink. He had stood at the dock for a long time. The sound had moved in its small contained rhythms around the dock's pilings, and the aluminum skiff had been absent, impounded since the Friday of the intercept, and the dock had held only the water and the light and the sound of the water and the western shore of the mainland, visible as a low dark line 5 miles away. The same view that the dock had offered on every night, Raymond Odell had left it in the dark and crossed to the other side with the outboard at low throttle and the navigation unit tracking the route and the island keeping what it was given. The island was keeping something else now. It was keeping the investigation's outcome, the formal resolution of 32 years of unanswered questions, keeping it in the way that places kept things that had happened in them, not in their foundations, but in the memory of the people who lived on them and had organized their lives around the geography of the keeping. Bet Cowan had been present for the verdict in New Bern. She had driven the 2 hours from Cedar Point on a Tuesday morning and had sat in the gallery and had received the verdict with the composure of a woman who had been carrying the weight of 2 coffee mugs for 20 years and who had not set them down and would not set them down but had added to the carrying. As the trial proceeded, the weight of everything the trial had made specific, the names and the dates and the routes on the GPS display and the families in the gallery, and who had organized all of it into the shape of something that could be carried without being defined by the carrying, which was a form of dignity that she had been practicing since 2004. The cottage at the southern end of Pelican Shoal was not renovated. Felix and Trudy Harbeck, who had purchased it as a premium rental investment and who had received, in the year between the purchase and the conclusion of the trial, considerably more than the standard complications of a coastal property renovation, made the decision in the spring of 2025 to deed the property to the Pelican Shoal Island Trust. a conservation organization that managed several parcels of the island's undeveloped land and that received the cottage and its lot with a stated intention to allow the structure to complete its natural decline and return the lot to the maritime shrub forest that bordered it. The forest reclaiming the cleared land at the pace of coastal vegetation, which was patient and comprehensive and did not require assistance. The process would take years. In the meantime, the cottage stood as it had stood, board and batten and raised on its foundation above the compacted sand, the ceiling fan no longer turning, the access panel in the foundation's northern face removed, and the opening sealed with new material that did not replicate the false latch mechanism. The false column in the crawl space dismantled by the forensic team in the course of the investigation, and its materials removed as evidence and never returned. The general store on the island's commercial strip had a small corkboard near its entrance where community notices were posted, ferry schedule changes and lost and found items and rental availability, and the occasional personal announcement. In October of 2025, the corkboard acquired a new item, a printed card in a plastic sleeve, placed there by Bet Cowan on the anniversary of the Caspers' arrival, that bore 2 names and 2 dates and a line beneath them that read, "They came here looking for the ocean and the sound and the particular quality of a week on an island, and they found it for a little while, and they deserved all of it and more." Bet had written the line herself. She had written it and rewritten it across 3 evenings before arriving at the version she considered right, which was the version that said what the situation required without saying more than the situation required. The version that was about the Caspers, specifically, rather than about everything else the case had become. The specific human fact of 2 people who had driven to a ferry terminal on a Saturday morning with a week's worth of hope kept separate from the larger weight of the 32 years and the shore and the GPS routes and the formal enumeration of the forensic report, which were also real and also necessary but were not what the card was for. The card was for the Caspers. Betty replaced it with a fresh print each October 17th. Pell retired from the Carteret County Sheriff's Department in the spring of 2026, 28 years after joining it, and 2 years after taking the ferry to Pelican Shoal on a Monday morning with his case file under his arm and looking at the island's profile on the southern horizon as it came into focus through the morning haze. He was given the standard retirement acknowledgement by the department and a gathering of colleagues that he attended with the moderate discomfort of a man who found public acknowledgement of his work less satisfying than the work itself, and who was glad when the gathering concluded and he could go home. He drove to Cedar Point on his first day of retirement and sat in the parking lot of the ferry terminal and looked at the sound for a while. The 7 o'clock ferry was loading. He watched it load and depart and diminish across the water in the direction of the island until it was the size of a model on the flat gray of the Sound, and then smaller than a model, and then a point, and then not visible. He sat for a while after it disappeared, and then he started the car and drove home. He did not go to the island again. June Hain visited the Carteret County Shoreline Memorial in the autumn of 2025. The memorial had been established on a section of the mainland shoreline adjacent to the forensic survey area, a modest installation that the county had developed in consultation with the families, and that consisted of a low granite bench facing the Sound with a plaque on its back panel bearing the names of those who had been identified from the survey's findings, arranged in the order of the dates associated with their presence in the record rather than alphabetically or by any other organizing principle. The chronological order being the most accurate representation of what the shore had held and for how long. She sat on the bench for a long time in the October afternoon, the Sound moving in its small rhythms before her and Pelican Shoal visible on the eastern horizon, the island's low profile holding its position on the horizon the way it had always held it, permanent and unremarkable and giving nothing away of what it had held across the years of the keeping. She had driven from Raleigh that morning, the same drive she had made in 2001 when the Coast Guard notification had circulated and she had identified her husband's name on it and had gone to Dare County to speak to the investigating officer and had been told that the drift pattern was within the range of possible outcomes given the conditions. The conditions, she thought, sitting on the granite bench with the Sound before her. The conditions had been a man with a 17-foot aluminum skiff and a private dock and 32 years of knowledge of the tidal patterns of Pamlico Sound. and the patience of someone who had organized his entire existence around a geography that he had decided, at some point in the years before 1991, to make into the instrument of a practice that the practice's own internal logic had sustained across 3 decades without the person practicing it appearing, to the community that surrounded him, as anything other than a useful and quiet man who fixed things on an island and knew the sound. She sat until the light began to go, and then she stood and looked at the plaque one more time, at the name in its place in the chronological order, and she walked back along the path to where she had parked and drove north toward the Outer Banks as the coastal evening came down around her, the sky going the particular colors of a coastal evening in autumn, the colors that did not appear inland, that were specific to the air above a body of water at the end of a warm day at the turning of the year, and she drove through them until they faded into the ordinary dark. Delia Marsh's book was published in the winter of 2025. Its opening chapter was about the ferry and the manifest and the specific quality of an island as an investigative setting. The closed-room geography that had made the Casper case immediately legible as a mystery in the formal sense, and that had simultaneously contained, in the solution to the mystery, the explanation for why the mystery had been possible in the first place. She wrote that the closed-room quality of a barrier island was the quality of a place where everything was visible and nothing was hidden in the way of things that were hidden in plain sight, where the smallness of the population and the intimacy of the community and the twice-daily rhythm of a ferry that recorded every crossing created the appearance of a transparency that was also, for someone who understood the geography from the inside, the perfect condition for the maintenance of something that needed to be invisible. She wrote that the sound had been the mechanism of the invisibility, that the sound at night was not the ferry manifest, that what crossed the sound in the dark was not recorded in the documentary system of an island whose twice-daily ferry was the primary frame through which the community's comings and goings were understood, and that the absence from the ferry manifest of a person who had been using the sound for 32 years was not evidence that the person had not been crossing it, but evidence that the documentary system did not extend to the dark water between the island and the mainland shore, and that this was a gap that someone had identified and had used with the patience of someone for whom the gap was the foundation of everything else. She wrote that the investigation had closed the gap. She wrote that it had closed it too late for the people whose names were on the granite bench and the corkboard card, and in the formal enumeration of the forensic report, and in the families who had organized their lives around the particular suspended weight of an unresolved absence. Too late for all of them, and not too late in the sense that the finding was the finding, and the finding was what made everything after it possible. The formal resolution of what the island had held, and the sound had crossed, and the shore had kept, available at last to the people who had been waiting for it across the full patient length of the waiting. The cottage at the southern end stood through its first winter after the trust's acquisition, the board and batten exterior weathering in the coastal wind and the salt air in the way of coastal structures when the maintenance that had sustained them is no longer applied, the paint going first and then the caulking, and then, slowly, the wood itself beginning to yield to the persistent chemistry of exposure. The maritime shrub forest at the property's landward boundary extended its reach across the cleared ground millimeter by millimeter in the way of coastal vegetation that had been waiting for the clearing to end, and that, once the clearing ended, was entirely prepared for the returning. The ceiling fan was still. The access panel was sealed. The crawl space was empty in the way of a space that has been emptied by attention and by time, and by the forensic and investigative work of people who had understood what the space had held, and had given it the full weight of their professional capacity and their human attention, and had taken from it what it held and had carried it out into the light and had given it its proper name. The island kept nothing now that should not be kept. The sound crossed at 7 and 4, and the manifest recorded every crossing, and the October light lay across the water of Pamlico Sound in the long horizontal way it lay across the water in the autumn, when the summer was finally over, and the season had turned, and the island held only what it should hold, which was the wind and the water and the sky, and the ordinary life of 212 people going about the business of being who they were in the place they had chosen, the island performing its permanent patient function of keeping the sea on one side and the sound on the other, and the lives of its people in between.